All right. Hello again, everybody. Happy Pride and welcome to Understanding Domestic Violence within the LGBTQIA2S plus community. My name is Mary Beth. I am the Community Education and Outreach Manager here at Women's Advocates, and I am so excited that everybody is here. We are going to start Pride Month off with a bang, talking about domestic violence and supporting LGBTQ plus survivors. First off, I'll introduce Women's Advocates a little bit. We are a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota. We offer what we call a continuum of safety from domestic violence through our prevention programming, like these webinars. We also have a 90-day emergency shelter and advocacy services, and we offer housing stability services for victim survivors after leaving shelter or just in the community. We began in 1972 as a legal advice helpline for women seeking divorce. And by 1974, we'd purchased our very first safe home to shelter abused women and children. It's been almost 50 years. Well, yeah, it's been almost 50 years since we started the shelter. It's been more than 50 years since we started the program. And during that time, we have expanded, and our shelter is now 3 connected homes. We've also updated our mission statement to better reflect what it is we do, which is walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. If you are interested in programming, outreach, prevention, or you're an advocate, we would love to have you, as Joe put in the chat, we'd love to have you at our monthly preventionist huddle. It's the second Wednesday of every month from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Central Time, and it's just a casual time where we all connect with each other as outreach and prevention workers. So you're welcome to join us for that. Women's Advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. You can view our full land acknowledgement at the link in the chat. Let's talk about what we're here to talk about today, which is understanding domestic violence in the LGBTQ plus community. We have a 3-parter here today to go through. So first, we're going to get on the same page with those shared definitions of domestic violence, what all those letters mean, what LGBTQ plus people go through. In part 2, we'll talk about the dynamics and forms of abuse that are specific or unique to folks in this community. And in part 3, we're going to have some practical tools. So what is needed to break down the barriers that victim survivors who are LGBTQ plus face when they're seeking support for domestic violence. Again, continue introducing yourselves in the chat, share comments, questions, concerns. You can also use the Q&A feature if you'd like. I'll leave a little time for questions at the end. A couple of disclaimers here. This is not going to be a super deep dive. This is a pretty introductory webinar to domestic violence in the community. There's a whole big beefy further reading section at the end though, so you can take a look at that. In that same vein, there will be a link to download the slides and get a certificate of attendance at the very end of the webinar. So for those of you who are wondering, will these slides be available? When will I get a certificate? At the end, they will be available. You will get a certificate, I promise. So that's available to you. And also, TV-related content, it affects everybody differently. This can be pretty upsetting. Please take care of yourself. Also, if you are also an LGBTQ person during this time today, hearing about the things that our community experiences, also pretty affecting and difficult sometimes. So take care of yourselves too. And then finally, to round out our Pride Month programming, we are hosting a panel called Advocacy Through a Queer Lens on Wednesday, June 21st from 1 to 2:30 p.m. I am dropping the registration link in the chat so you can so that you can register for that as well, because we are going to host a panel of LGBTQ identifying advocates talking about the past, present, and future of advocacy for domestic violence and queer folks' involvement in it. I'm really excited. Joe's put a lot of good programming together for it. It's going to be a good time, so please consider joining us for that as well. All right, I've talked enough about housekeeping stuff. Let's get going. Let's talk about shared definitions, getting on the same page about what this community is and what domestic violence is. It's 2023, so a lot of people already know what these letters mean. The acronym LGBTQIA2S+, you may have also seen LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQI, LGBTQIA. You've seen a lot of different iterations of this acronym over the years. We're constantly re-including different identities at different times. Yes, the alphabet mafia is alive and well. But I wanted to clarify just a couple of identities that folks that I've encountered have been the most confused or needing the most guidance about. Lesbian and gay, I feel pretty standard about those. I think we have a good understanding of who that applies to. Bisexual and transgender, though, I'm going to go into a little more detail. The label bisexual describes somebody who's physically, sexually, or emotionally attracted to not men and women, their same sex or gender, and others. It's very important to note that bisexual does not mean attracted to men and women. We often think that it does. In fact, it means same and other. It includes folks who are attracted to people of their gender identity, whether that is cis male, cis female, transgender, non-binary, and then other genders that are not theirs. So that includes, and good question, someone asking to explain the difference between bisexual and pansexual. The bisexual community will tell you that there is not a difference. The pansexual folks will tell you that there is a difference. That difference kind of depends on who you talk to. But for me, what I would say is bi plus or bisexual includes people who are attracted to multiple or many genders. So this can include queer or pansexual people. Bisexual has kind of become an umbrella term in itself. That's not a great answer, I know. I can't tell you like specifically the differences of which genders are attracted, which genders are pansexual and which are not, because that's just not something that we can do. But those terms are very tightly linked, and bisexual has become a sort of umbrella term to describe the diversity of attraction. Many say bi is attracted to binary genders and pan is full gender spectrum as well. That is also a definition. Again, queer people are different. Like LGBTQ people, we are all different individuals. We have different ideas and understandings of our experience. You could ask 4 different people what the difference is and get 4 different answers. You could ask 100 different people what the difference between bi and pan is and get 100 different answers. Part of being LGBTQ is being okay with non-closure and holding all of those differences and not trying to nail them down in any one way. All right, moving into transgender, that's somebody whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. Folks who are trans might not just use transgender to describe their gender. More specifically, they might use genderqueer or non-binary. There are some folks who refer to themselves as transsexual, even though that is not really a term that is common and often has a negative connotation. People will use lots of different words to describe their experiences, because language can be freeing, but it also can be limiting. All right, a couple of other terms here. There's asexual, intersex, two-spirit, and queer. Those are kind of the back ends of this particular acronym. Asexual folks do not experience sexual attraction. There are also aromantic folks who do not experience romantic attraction. There are two-spirit people. Two-spirit, I want to be very clear, is a gender identity, not always a sexual orientation, and it is a specific label for members of Indigenous tribes and nations. Non-Native, non-Indigenous people cannot be two-spirit. This is not everything is for everyone. Two-spirit folks have a deep cultural significance that is different depending on the tribe or nation they belong to. It is both a gender identity and a spiritual cultural role that is specific to folks from Indigenous communities. Intersex people are born with sex characteristics that you wouldn't recognize as strictly male or female. There are folks whose secondary sex characteristics do not match up with their chromosomes or do not match up with their primary sex characteristics. For the intersex community, unfortunately, their gender is often forcibly assigned at birth by the medical professionals who deliver them, based on which of their sex characteristics are the most prominent at that particular time. Instead of saying, you have a healthy intersex child, doctors will say, you have a healthy baby girl who was born with some testes. And then that child will be girled for the rest of their lives until something happens that makes those other sex characteristics come out. So a lot of intersex folks are victims of medical homophobia and transphobia. And then there's the term queer, which describes not exclusively heterosexual. This is an umbrella term. It is a reclaimed slur. It is still a slur and pejorative term in many places for many people. However, it has been reclaimed for a lot of folks. And now you go to Target and you see a big shirt that's got the word queer all over it. The word queer, along with many other words, has been used as an insult by homophobes. It's been used during hate crimes. The language of homophobia is constantly evolving. Honestly, anything that you can, any tone of voice can make a word not quite a slur, but any tone of voice, any particular word can be used with the right tone of voice to be hateful. The language of homophobia is always evolving. So with the term queer, I typically avoid it when I describe individual people, unless I know for a fact that that's how they would describe themselves. I don't particularly like being called queer. I prefer people to know me as a lesbian. However, I'm not really going to get in my feelings about it unless people are deliberately ignoring my lesbianism to call me queer. So I usually avoid the term queer to describe individuals unless I know that that's how they describe themselves, just because people's experiences with that word are so fraught and varied. Some have had that word leveled against them during incidents of homophobic violence. Some people have found a really important, warm home in that. We're all different people. We all have different experiences of the words that we belong to or we identify with. So in keeping with that, self-identification is key here. If you are struggling with the correct term to refer to somebody that you're working with or somebody you know, just ask. It is a basic courtesy to call somebody by the name and pronouns and identity that they want to be called. That is a critical part of supporting any survivor's right to self-determination, which is what we're trying to do here when folks come to us after abusive relationships, is we're trying to reaffirm and reinforce their self-determination. So call them what they want to be called. In her book, The Argonauts, which you should always read, you should definitely consider reading, Maggie Nelson writes, the best way to find out about how people feel about their gender or their sexuality, or anything else really, is to listen to what they tell you and try to treat them accordingly without shellacking over their version of reality with yours. So if you meet somebody who says, I'm trans, and you think, huh, you do not look how a trans person looks to me. How you think a trans person looks does not matter. They just told you they're trans, and so you're going to refer to them as such. However, our personalities aren't defined by sexual orientation alone. Straight people aren't like all straight, only straight all the time. They have other interests. I'm not only a lesbian all the time, I have other interests too. Thinking of anybody only in terms of their sexual orientation can flatten the many dimensions of the human soul. For a lot of people, their sexual orientation isn't their most salient identity. They have other parts of their lives. We're all complex human beings, right? So different parts and pieces of ourselves might come out at different times, depending on the circumstances. Maybe one person's sexual orientation is less important to them than their gender identity or racial identity or where they live. Like, sure, I'm a lesbian, but I'm also a European American woman. I like to cook, I volunteer, I'm married, I am hard of hearing. Not all of these parts of my life are at the forefront at any given time, but they all make me who I am. So yes, our sexual orientations are deeply important, but they also are not everything. Stars, they're just like us. So domestic violence, that's why we're all here, right? Domestic violence is a 24/7 pattern designed to exert control over another person, to exercise power in a way that makes that person afraid, small, feeling unsafe all of the time. Physical assault can but doesn't always happen in an abusive relationship, but what does always happen is a form of psychological terrorism. It's important to note, especially when you're working with LGBTQ plus survivors, that it doesn't have to be an abusive relationship, doesn't have to be romantic or sexual. Family members and roommates can also perpetrate domestic violence. That domestic is people you live with. There are folks who are experiencing domestic violence from their parents, and part of that domestic violence is homophobia or is transphobia. The thing that makes domestic violence different from stranger violence is that close relationship. People know their target, the target of their abuse, in an intimate and personal way. They know, hey, my partner is struggling with gender dysphoria, and a comment about how they're struggling to pass right now could really mess them up psychologically. A partner would know that, and a stranger would not. So that's an example of the kind of different harm that domestic violence can incur as opposed to stranger violence. Well, you'll see on the wheel here, there are different tactics: that isolation, harassment, financial abuse, and those are all common in all forms of domestic violence, whether the survivor is LGBTQ or not. However, harassment, financial abuse, and isolation have particularly dire consequences for LGBTQ survivors. LGBTQ people are especially vulnerable to verbal harassment and financial abuse as power and control tactics because they experience higher rates of bias-motivated violence in other areas of their lives. We'll talk a little bit about that a couple slides later when we get into minority stress theory. All right. I want to introduce the concept of misconceptions about abuse in the LGBTQ plus community. So I'm going to launch a poll listing all of these misconceptions, and I want to know, which ones have you heard before or believed before? A lot of people who are starting out in the field or who have not ever met a gay person or have only ever worked with straight or cisgender survivors of domestic violence do hold some of these misconceptions, like believing that abuse is less common in gay relationships or doesn't occur at all. or that you can tell in abusive relationships between queer people who's the abuser because of who's bigger or stronger, or that same-sex violence just doesn't happen, or that it's not as severe. All of these are very common misconceptions, and we'll talk about the damage that these misconceptions do later on. But while you're answering that poll, I'll just say, for a very long time, and I've been doing this work for almost 10 years now, and I've been gay for longer than that. But for a long time, I thought that domestic violence was a straight people problem. I wanted to believe that domestic violence was directly the cause of patriarchal norms and standards, and was a direct consequence of men's hatred of women, and that queer lives and families were immune to interpersonal violence by some virtue of being liberated from heterosexual norms and dynamics. And I was wrong about that. I will say domestic violence is a cause of an effect of patriarchal norms and standards. It is a consequence of men's hatred of women, but it's not specific to heterosexual people. I was wrong, because although domestic violence usually does occur in a gendered context, it's not only about gender, it's about power. It's about a person's belief that getting what they want matters more than other people's freedom and safety. It's about entitlement. And as much as I love us, LGBTQ people can be entitled abusers too. So I think it's important to say that. I'm going to end this poll here and share our results. And let's see what the most common misconception is here. Far and away, with 55% of people reporting, they believe the misconception that domestic violence in LGBT+ relationships is the same as domestic violence in straight relationships. I did kind of trick you, right? Like, because yes, domestic violence can be the same in gay relationships and straight relationships. Like, it happens in both, and some of the tactics will be similar, but because by virtue of people's experiences of homophobic oppression, and external stresses due to homophobia or transphobia, the tactics experienced by victim survivors in abusive queer relationships are going to be a little different. There are tactics very specific to queer relationships that are used by abusers. And we're going to talk about what some of those are. All right. So statistically speaking, it's always a struggle to research for this webinar, because research on domestic violence within queer communities has not been integrated into the mainstream narrative on domestic violence. You'll see a lot of research on LGBTQ+ people and a lot of research on domestic violence, but there's not a lot of information in the middle of that Venn diagram, and limited culturally specific resources exist. And this is both because of and contributes to all of those misconceptions that we just saw on the previous slide. There aren't a lot of services for queer people who have experienced DV because people don't think that it happens. And because those services don't exist, people aren't coming to those services and boosting the statistics of who experiences domestic violence. So those problems kind of feed into each other, into this sort of whirlpool effect. So the original goal of that gender paradigm in domestic violence, that men are perpetrators, women are victims, the goal of that was to right this centuries-old wrong against women, to recognize that women weren't being abused by nobody, that somebody, men, was abusing women. And that was an important and revolutionary statement to make, and it still is, that men abuse women. Unfortunately, that dynamic and the power and control wheel does remain a heterosexist model of abuse. It involves a violent, controlling man and a passive woman, ignoring the fact that people can experience and perpetrate abuse outside of that heterosexual dynamic. 20 years of research estimates that rates of domestic violence in same-sex relationships are actually pretty comparable to those of heterosexual relationships. However, fewer non-straight people come forward, and that is due in no small part to the pervasiveness of those misconceptions that we saw in the last slide. So here are some numbers. Domestic violence does happen to queer people. The folks with the highest risk of domestic violence are bisexual women in relationships with heterosexual men. Trans women are twice as likely as other genders to face intimate partner harassment. Trans survivors are 3 times likelier than cis survivors to report being stalked by their intimate partner. All of these are horrifying statistics, right? I do want to give a disclaimer that information about some types of domestic violence and the number of queer people experiencing it is lacking. When you research stuff like this, you're going to find a lot of instances of not enough information, research is needed, numbers not reportable. And there are a lot of folks that I know who are out there doing some incredible research right now about the prevalence of domestic violence in queer communities in different parts of the world. Shout out to some folks at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who have just finished this research. But if you are in a position to, or if your organization has the capacity, consider doing your part to advance research on this subject, because the more we know, the more we can do, right? And the more we can prove to governments and funders that this is a need, and we can help. I do want to say that these statistics are not to say that any one group has it worse than another. I do not think that is a useful tool. I don't think anybody wins the oppression Olympics. Rather, I want us to encourage solidarity because we are all affected by this. It is statistically very likely that somebody you've worked with or lived with or studied with or been on the bus with has experienced abuse. You've met people who've experienced abuse, and you've met people who've used abuse. It's pretty common for folks to realize during presentations like these that they have experienced abuse. For queer people in particular, a lot of folks take webinars or go to presentations like these and realize that they've experienced abuse themselves, but they didn't call it that. They didn't call it abuse because they thought the term was reserved for other people. Those misconceptions, right? Maybe they thought abuse was something that happened to straight people, or cisgender people, or people who are only being physically assaulted. But these statistics show that relationship violence can and does happen in our community. And as difficult as that is to reconcile, that we're not liberated from the same struggles that straight and cisgender people experience, I hope that it helps you feel less alone. People who experience abuse are going to carry it with them for the rest of their lives. And there are so many different ways that experiencing abuse and domestic violence can impact our sense of well-being and our sense of self in turn. And those physical and emotional health impacts are intertwined, right? Like 84% of survivors are diagnosed with PTSD. That can cause traumatic nightmares, which can lead to insomnia. 77% of survivors are diagnosed with depression, 75% with anxiety. And those problems can manifest as migraines, chronic pain, hyperventilation, gastrointestinal symptoms. And it's important to know that the effects of domestic violence are the same for queer and trans people as they are for straight and cisgender people. What might differ is a person's willingness or ability to seek medical care or to receive compassionate medical care for these issues. Okay, I promised that we would talk about minority stress theory. Here we are. Keeping in mind that we do not live single issue lives. As a lesbian who is a survivor of sexual violence, I do not get to choose when I wake up in the morning which one I would rather be. I cannot choose to be just a survivor. I cannot choose to be just a lesbian. I am both indivisibly. And so these survivors face the double closet, which is a phrase coined by Ellen Koshak. It comes out of minority stress theory, which is the idea that when marginalized people experience stressors, those stressors are both unique to their marginalized status and additive. So they experience that unique harm, but it's also compounded because they're experiencing it in the context of existing oppression. So the double closet is an example of this. It refers to the specific stressor faced by queer survivors. LGBTQ people who are experiencing domestic violence face discrimination from both internal and external homophobia and from the stigma of being a victim of domestic violence. So they face two barriers to receiving assistance, right? First, they have to come out as a survivor of domestic violence. And then they have to come out as gay. Or first they have to come out and say, look, I'm queer, I'm gay, I'm bisexual. Have to deal with the fallout of that coming out process, and then have to say, and also my relationship has been abusive. Those are two closets that are really hard to come out of, and that there are a lot of repercussions for coming out of. Let's talk about unique dynamics and forms of abuse experienced by LGBTQ people in abusive relationships. It is important first to frame our understanding of domestic violence in the LGBTQ+ community in this broader context of anti-gay bias, ableism, and other forms of discrimination, racism, anti-immigration. It's really important that we understand that there are unique vulnerabilities to domestic violence and unique barriers to accessing services that LGBTQ communities face. And those barriers and vulnerabilities are compounded by the broader social discriminations. With the common understanding that homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia all exist and are harmful and can intersect with other identities and experiences of marginalization, we also know that these beliefs can be internalized even without a person realizing it. We can learn hateful or intolerant behavior even though we belong to a particular community. Because we live in a society. We internalize public homophobia through societal depictions of LGBTQ people or through our experience of institutions like law, policy, healthcare, education. An abusive person in an LGBTQ relationship might use homophobic or biphobic or transphobic statements and level those at their partner to make their partner experience internalized homophobia or biphobia or transphobia as part of their abuse, as another way of putting this person down. Someone who's working through internalized homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia, which is unfortunately a lot of LGBTQ people living in a world that does not particularly care for us. So when we're working through that, we might inadvertently repeat or internalize homophobic or transphobic statements, even when we belong to those communities. And that causes a lot of stress. There's some cognitive dissonance that happens, there's anxiety, and it can deeply harm interpersonal relationships, especially if you start to weaponize that internalized homophobia. Internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia is all of those things on the left. It's internalized oppression. It can be conscious or unconscious. It can prevent people from reporting abuse. What it is not is an excuse for abusive behavior. If I were to call out somebody for being abusive, for treating their partner in a horrific way or making a awful joke about their partner's identity, and they say, oh no, like it's okay because like I've got internalized homophobia, my response to that is going to be not an excuse. It's not okay. You have to work on that and not put it on other people. So those who struggle with internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia can then externalize it onto others. The abusive person can project their internalized hatred of themselves and their community onto their partner in ways that minimize, try to justify or deny, or even directly contribute to their abuse. They might say things like, you defended yourself against me, so you're the real abuser. Self-defense is more common in same-gender domestic violence than in heterosexual relationships. The abusive person can and will and often does use a victim's use of self-defense to say the victim is actually the abusive one. That does happen in heterosexual relationships too. It just happens more often in same-sex relationships. They might say, no, I wasn't abusing you, we were just fighting. Painting the abuse as mutual or as just a fight is an effort to control the victim into not naming their experience as domestic violence and not identifying with being a survivor of abuse, which then alienates them from seeking support. Same thing with the idea that women can't abuse women, so what I did to you wasn't abuse. Like, that's just going to keep people from realizing the truth of their experience and seeking help. And the idea that this is just how these relationships are. If you leave me, nobody else is going to treat you any better. Also keeps people from naming their experiences as abuse because they're naming their experience as normal. All right. Now we're going to talk about some specific forms of abuse that LGBTQ folks face. These forms are specific to people in LGBTQ plus relationships, are not super common in heterosexual relationships. I'm not going to say they don't happen ever, but that far and away, these tactics are more common and more specific to the queer community. Some of these forms of abuse are having to prove your identity. I've worked with survivors who are women in relationships with other women who were forced to prove that they were lesbian and not really bi. So forced public displays of affection, forced participation in unwanted sex. There's also willful misinterpretation of identity, just saying things that straight up aren't true about the person's identity in an effort to upset them. There's the sexual hierarchy or threats of outing. For bisexual women dating heterosexual men, there is a dangerous intersection of misogyny and biphobia. Really common stereotypes surrounding bisexual people being promiscuous can lead to increased sexual violence and rape if partners assume that their bisexual partner is up for anything. By women who don't consent to objectifying sex acts or who strongly identify with the LGBT community might be at increased risk for violence from their straight male partners. I will say threats of outing are a form of emotional abuse. Threatening to out somebody who is not open about their relationship can be used, is a form of trying to gain psychological leverage over a person who has to keep their orientation private. It's not to say that anytime a person that simply wishing your partner were out and that you could be together publicly, That's not abuse. It's when you say, if you leave me, I will tell everyone that you are gay or trans. Um, I think it's very normal for people in relationships where one partner is closeted to wish that that weren't the case. And that's simply wishing that you could be open about your relationship and your care for each other is not abusive. It's when you start threatening consequences. It's when you start threatening to out people that it becomes abusive, because you're taking away that person's right to determine when they are coming out for themselves. All right, we're going to take a quiz here. If you could put in the chat A, B, or C for your correct answer. Scenario: you've got a friend, Alicia, who's been dating a guy named John for a few months. Alicia is bisexual. John knows and claims to be fine with it. But one day, John showed up at Alicia's work and saw her give a female friend a hug. John later suggested a threesome with that friend, and Alicia declined, telling him that that was not an okay thing to say to her. John grabbed her by the arm and called her a slut and accused her of cheating. If Alicia was your friend and she told you that this happened, you would A, would you tell Alicia that John's behavior was really concerning and offer to help her find support? Would you B, ask Alicia if she was sure she wasn't just trying to make John jealous by hugging her friend? Or would you C, tell another friend what Alicia said and hope that they would do something to help? Love how many people are putting A in the chat. There's no super wrong answer here. Just, I mean, I would say B is the wrong answer because B for biphobia. But there are answers that result in more or less support. Yeah. All right. Other forms of abuse that that LGBTQ individuals might face or might perpetrate against a partner are exploiting a lack of support, leveraging institutional violence, using small communities, and policing identity and expression. So what I mean by exploiting a lack of support, I mentioned earlier that there aren't a lot of services available specifically for LGBTQ folks who've experienced DV. Queer people know this, and abusers will say, well, yeah, sure, report me, but to who? You'll have nowhere to go if you leave, or there are no resources for LGBT survivors. In rural areas or areas with no culturally specific resources for queer survivors, a survivor might be forced to go to a highly Christian or fundamentalist program that does not, and stay closeted because those programs don't accept or provide services to openly gay people. So abusers will threaten to out the survivor to those support services so that they don't get the service they need. That happens all the time. It's part of the reason why there shouldn't be programs that discriminate based on sexual orientation, because abusers will leverage that discrimination. Then leveraging institutional violence. They might say, oh, you want to call the cops? You really want to call the cops? Cops hate gay people. They're not going to do anything for us. An abuser would threaten that institutions won't take the abuse seriously or would criminalize the survivor. That is a form of abuse. It's a way to dissuade survivors from seeking help by telling them that when they seek help, they're going to get in trouble themselves. Using small communities. In the Twin Cities, we have a very large and thriving gay scene, and yet it is often like being in a small town. Everybody knows everybody, or knows people who know people. So abusers will use those small communities and they will isolate their partner. They'll say, no, you can't go to the one or two social spaces that exist for us, and keep them isolated from community and support. Or if they're already in the community, they will say, well, if you leave, I'm still going to go to all of these places, so you won't get to go. An abuser will threaten a victim with loss of access to those community spaces if the individual reports or leaves. Or they'll say, yeah, if you tell anybody what I did to you, I'm going to tell everybody that you're lying, that you're crazy, that you actually abused me. Abusers will use harassment and insults and gossip to get victims kicked out of or shunned from the community that they desperately need. And then policing of identity and expression. This is one that is fairly common for straight couples, straight abusive relationships as well. Policing of what the victim can wear, what they get to look like. Victim survivors will have their outfits controlled, be told to look or act a certain way, to be more or less gay. All right, another scenario here, you can tell us A, B, or C. What would you do? So Rebecca and Janet met at the mall. When they first began dating, Rebecca was really sweet, but over time, she started putting Janet down and once ended a fight by slapping Janet. Things got worse, and Rebecca told Janet that if she ever left, Rebecca would tell Janet's homophobic parents and workplace about their relationship. If Janet told you this was happening to her, would you, A, ask her why she hasn't just come out to her parents to get out ahead of Rebecca's threats? Would you, B, tell Janet that you care about her and offer to help her plan what to do next? Or would you, C, ask Janet if she was really sure that Rebecca meant what she said, because you'd heard relationships between two women couldn't be that bad? Lots of folks saying B. Love it. Thank you. Yeah, don't ask somebody who is experiencing threats of outing why they don't just out themselves and get out ahead of it. If they wanted to be out by now, they would. A lot of folks, if they wanted to be out, they would. Or if they could be out, they would. All right, so let's break down some of these barriers that are facing LGBTQ victim survivors of domestic violence. There are so many misconceptions about why survivors stay or can't leave abusive relationships and situations. People who experience abuse are faced with so many difficult decisions to navigate, often on their own because domestic violence is isolating, and often with very limited resources and support. So it does take a lot of time to leave. And there are an endless number of other reasons why staying might feel safer for a survivor in that moment, or why leaving would pose challenges that the survivor doesn't have the capacity to overcome. As advocates, as people who love survivors, it is not our place to say what they would do, what we should do in their situation, or what they should have done to avoid experiencing abuse. Survivors deserve compassion and non-judgment, and we know that even if they leave, it doesn't always guarantee safety. We're going to get into some of these barriers in more detail on the following slides, but for now, queer and trans victim survivors often have trouble leaving because of financial barriers, fears of being outed or harassed, fear of homophobic violence. I want to address the question of, does having the name women's advocates limit different identities from using your resource? And in name only, sure. There are a lot of people who see the name women's advocates and think this is not for me. I'm not a woman, so I can't get this support. Our services are open to everybody. We make that very clear on all of our communications, all of our brochures, all of our outreach materials. And we offer a lot of services that are open to all genders, including support groups and pop-up advocacy. And we can't discriminate by gender in our emergency shelter. So the services are open to everybody, but you are correct that having a name like Women's Advocates is going to deter people who don't read that, who don't read that our outreach materials that we're open to everybody. Some people just read the name Women's Advocates and stop at women's and say, well, this isn't for me. That's a conversation we are always having. It is definitely, we have to balance the name recognition with the fact that our services might appear to be not available to people who aren't women. Yeah, so there's that. But yes, back to our conversation. There are lots of barriers to leaving abusive relationships. We are gonna, and to seeking support for abusive relationships. We're gonna get into detail on some of these. So, the barrier that victim survivors face to safety, to seeking safety from abuse, one of these is law enforcement responses. Law enforcement have a history of not quite, well, I'm not going to generalize, but I am going to say that because there is no standardized training for police departments across this country, every single police department's response to DV is going to be a little bit different. Historically, law enforcement will respond to domestic violence calls in same-sex relationships with dual arrest. They'll arrest both people or no people or the wrong person. They might treat the incident as a stranger assault or as non-domestic violence, which ignores some of the needs that victim survivors of DV have. Or they'll give follow-up resources that are geared towards straight people. I want to say here when talking about how law enforcement will respond to a domestic violence incident, that perception of response is going to be a factor too. The anticipation of a queer person that they're going to experience homophobia and stigma from police officers during their response does contribute to queer people's reluctance to contact the police when experiencing domestic violence. They think, I'm not going to call the cops because when they get here, they're going to misgender me, or when they get here, they're going to throw some slurs out, or when they get here, they're not going to understand what's happening. And that perception, that fear is not without context. There is a deep history of criminalization of our community by the police. There are still cities and states with laws on the books that directly criminalize LGBTQ ways of life. And there are cities and states that are putting those laws back on the books right now. Think gendered clothing laws, anti-sodomy laws. Many states don't enforce those anymore. Some of them are starting to enforce those again. But for decades, there were violent police crackdowns and just horror crimes against our humanity as LGBTQ people. And the memory of that violence lives on and contributes to community mistrust and people not calling the cops in a life-threatening situation. And then when LGBTQ survivors do contact law enforcement during an incident, there is still the risk of an insufficient response. Police in a Texas study were significantly less likely to make an arrest in a domestic violence incident involving a same-gender couple than a different gender couple, even when the victim was willing to cooperate with an arrest or charges. So the response is not, we need culturally sensitive and anti-homophobic programming for first responders, law enforcement, and court personnel so that they understand that this happens to us. It might look a little different, but it is it's still violence, and that we deserve support too. And then a barrier to support. There's a barrier to receiving support that queer people face, and one of those barriers are all of those misconceptions on that slide a couple slides ago. That contribute to a misunderstanding about what it looks like to be queer and to experience domestic violence. When I think about the many misconceptions surrounding LGBTQ people and intimate partner violence, and about the very sparse literature that exists about its prevalence and its patterns, I think about the phrase, you can't be what you can't see. Representation really matters. If you are a lesbian in a relationship who had internalized the idea that oh, women don't abuse, same-sex partner violence doesn't exist. And then your partner starts to insult or assault you. How would you know to call that abuse? If you had believed that that wasn't possible for people like you wouldn't identify with it, right? Would you know that you could seek advocacy or protections? Maybe not. So those misconceptions have real consequences. If our communities aren't talking about it, if advocacy centers aren't proactively reaching out to our community through partnerships or advertising, how are we supposed to know that those services are there for us? So service providers and people who are responsible for marketing and communications and outreach at your organization, you can do your part here to help correct some of these misconceptions and break barriers to support by creating materials that feature LGBTQ people and address domestic violence in the community, because we're having a hard time right now. There are lots of beliefs that that other people, that abuse from same-sex partners doesn't exist or isn't real abuse. And that's wrong. I also want to say, as a member of the community, that the community needs to talk about this too. I think there is a deep fear of bringing up the fact that domestic violence in queer communities is just as common as domestic violence in heterosexual relationships. I think that fear comes from we don't want the straight people to know that we have this fault, because homophobes are already looking for faults to exploit, and we don't want to bring this one up too. It's a real concern, but we really need to talk about this. Domestic violence in queer communities we need to discuss it. We need to call it domestic violence. We can't just call it toxic relationships. We can't just call it drama and bring out our little popcorn bags and watch it happen and be entertained. We have to name it as violence. We have to name it as wrong. And we have to say that is enough. Because if we're not doing that, we're hurting ourselves, and we're not getting the support that we need. There are straight people who need to work on their own misconceptions about queer people and domestic violence, but our community has to do just as much work to correct those misconceptions ourselves. Yeah, it's not your gay friends being messy. They literally, it's domestic violence. They need support. So if you are in a position to do so, please consider creating some inclusive outreach materials, engaging in outreach that directly addresses queer survivors and abuse in LGBTQ communities. If you have the capacity in your program, maybe reach out to some gay bars, maybe reach out to your local pride. Start tabling at pride festivals, start doing some education to staff at gay bars, at clubs, at HIV clinics, because this is important. It affects us too. And then finally, let's talk about barriers to LGBTQ survivors accessing healing. Biggest barrier of all, exclusionary service practices, including medical homophobia and transphobia, gendered supports, and heteronormativity in reporting. So I'm looking here at a 2010 study by the National Center for Victims of Crime, which surveyed 650 domestic violence agencies, sexual assault centers, prosecutors' offices, law enforcement, all of those victim services people. They asked in this survey, do you serve LGBTQ survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence? 94% of those programs said no, they don't serve. They are not currently serving LGBTQ survivors. My thoughts on that are, I don't think that's true. I think a good chunk of people that they served probably just didn't out themselves as LGBTQ. They probably were serving queer people at the time. They just didn't know they were. Non-disclosure is real. People will stay closeted if it means that they get the help they need. This is also pretty common for survivors who are cisgender or heterosexual men too, because there's this heteronormative understanding of domestic violence that looks at cisgender men abusing cisgender women. And if you don't fit that narrative, then you don't get the services. Same for transgender women too. Exclusionary service practices like segregation in shelter or denial of services towards trans people in shelter keeps a lot of trans women from accessing the support that they need. Medical homophobia and transphobia is super common still, unfortunately. And so trans and gender nonconforming individuals who experience an assault and go to the hospital or go to the doctor for medical attention might face transphobic or invasive questions when they're seeking medical care. They might face questions that are totally unrelated to the incident that brought them to the doctor. And that's not cool. LGBT individuals might face homophobic rhetoric when they're seeking medical care. And a lot of that's because medical professionals might not have received this specialized training about supporting queer victim survivors or queer patients in general. Talking about gendered supports, we talked about this a little bit with the question about, like, does the name women's advocates turn non-women off from seeking our services? Yes, short answer, yes. Transgender and gender non-conforming folks might not be aware of support that's open to any gender. And there might not be a lot of supports that are open to any gender. Domestic violence resources in your area might be restricted to specific genders. Individuals might not know if those services are trans friendly. And if you're unsure, if I was a trans person trying to get help and I was unsure if a program was trans friendly or not, I wouldn't want to call and find out that they weren't. So I probably wouldn't call. Yeah. And then heteronormativity in reporting and support is also a barrier to healing. Individuals might not want to report their experiences of abuse because maybe their legal documents don't match their chosen name or reflect their identity. And the reporting process itself might use gendered language or binary gender markers in the reporting process. People might be invalidated by the very system that they went to, might have their gender invalidated by the very system they went to seek validation about their experience of abuse. So breaking it down, we need culturally sensitive programming for medical institutions and for people who work directly with victim survivors. If we have any curriculum builders in the house, maybe consider putting together a domestic violence and queer communities training for medical institutions. That would be neat. I would love that. If you do that, send it to us. Okay, I want to talk quickly about what organizations should be doing to protect domestic violence survivors who are LGBTQ. This checklist is an organizational audit. I'm not trying to put anybody on blast here. I'm just giving this to you as a tool that you can use to gauge whether your organization is on the right track to supporting survivors of all genders and sexualities. It is really important that every organization who works with victim survivors recognizes that domestic violence is not just a straight people thing, that even though you might not be seeing a lot of queer people in your organization or coming to seek your services, that doesn't mean they don't exist. So it's important to provide equity training on how to advocate for or how to work with or understand the experiences of queer survivors. Also important necessary, in fact, is a non-discrimination policy. If you are a shelter or if you are a domestic violence program, you need to have a non-discrimination policy that says we do not discriminate by sexual orientation or gender identity, and the people who use our services should not be discriminating or harassing based on sexual orientation and gender identity. If you're a shelter and if you're a women's shelter and you bring in and you have a trans woman resident, your staff needs to be trained to be not transphobic, and your other residents who are cisgender need to understand that they can't be transphobic either. You need to be prioritizing everybody's safety and everybody's right to exist without discrimination. Also question, does your organization have LGBTQ plus staff members? And are those staff members supported? That's really important as well. It's not enough to just say like, I'm very proud of women's advocates and the work that we're doing. It would not be enough for women's advocates to say, oh yeah, Mary Beth's gay. We're doing great, Mary Beth's gay. If they weren't giving my wife health, if they weren't giving me the opportunity to put my wife on my health insurance or like take time off during my gay wedding, like that wouldn't be just saying like, ah, yes, Mary Beth is gay, would not be enough for me personally. And we deserve better. And then finally, it's important to check around and see if your organization makes people aware in communications and advertisements that the program welcomes survivors of any gender and sexual orientation. Yeah, that's also important to do because people need to know that you're there for them so that they can go to you. All of this is just a starting point. These are basics. You should all have these, and your organizations should all have these. Once you have all these boxes checked, more are going to follow. Someone in the chat is asking, what is the best way to explain or educate that having a trans resident in shelter does not increase the risk of abuse towards others? Yeah, people do seem to have that misconception that trans women are inherently predatory, when in fact, trans women have a higher risk of being victims of violent crime than perpetrating violent crime. So you can use that. You can use that little nugget that trans women, trans residents are actually more likely to experience abuse than they are to perpetrate it. And I mean, figure out if you have to do something, like if you have to change a little bit of something of how your shelter is structured or how things are built, where bedrooms and bathrooms are to make people like a little more comfortable. And you have the ability to do that, great, that might go a long way. But honestly, I think a lot of that misunderstanding comes from the fact that most people who hold that misconception don't actually know any real life trans people or don't know that they know any real life trans people. Yeah, and yes, as Joe said, I think that misunderstanding comes from assuming that trans women are men when they're not. They're women. They're trans women, and so they're not gonna perpetrate crime like men do. They're women. Yeah, so those are some suggestions. But yeah, that is it's 2023. Things are really hard for trans people right now. My other suggestion is saying things are really hard for trans people right now. Why would we as an organization do anything to make it harder? There's that. Okay, so I want to share some practical tools and tips about language to avoid and language to embrace when you are working with queer and trans survivors of abuse. First, we're going to start with stuff to avoid. First off, in these bottom orange boxes here, we have dead naming or misgendering somebody without correcting yourself. Dead naming, for those who don't know, is using a person's name that was their name prior to their transition when they have since changed their name. Misgendering is using the wrong pronouns or referring to a woman as a man. If you do that, like if you are working with somebody and you accidentally misgender them, or if you accidentally call them by the wrong name, don't just hope they didn't notice and like keep going. Stop, correct yourself, and apologize. However, on the apology point, don't over apologize. Don't wear a hair shirt about it. Don't self-flagellate if you get something wrong. We are human. We make mistakes. It does happen that, like, if somebody that we know is transitioning and we have to change the pronouns and the name that we've used for them, that's not always a very smooth shift. And so mistakes do happen. The thing to do is to apologize, correct yourself, and move on very quickly and efficiently. Instead of saying like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. This is just so hard for me. I'm working so hard. Like, I didn't mean to do it. It won't happen again. Oh my God, I feel so bad. Like, don't do that, because harping on our mistakes puts victim survivors in an awkward position where they are having to comfort and reassure the person who is supposed to be comforting and reassuring them. Even if it's not malicious, even if you're not maliciously misgendering somebody, that it breaks trust to be doing it constantly, or to be making that person have to comfort you or reassure you. Breaks their trust. Avoid asking questions that have nothing at all to do with the person's experience of domestic violence. Stuff like, okay, well, yeah, you're at a women's shelter, but your driver's license says you're male. What's the deal with that? Do you really need to know? I would like us all to, when we're working with queer and trans survivors, any survivor actually, to make the distinction between, am I asking this because the answer is directly going to assist me and this person in achieving safety or healing? Or am I asking this question because I want to know the answer? Like because I'm curious about the answer, or would the answer actually be helpful? If you're asking a question and the answer is not actually necessary and you're just like kind of curious, don't ask it. Please don't ask it. Stick to the topic. Your victim survivors are not here to satisfy your own personal curiosity. So keep it on topic. Asking the victim survivors that you are working with to be quieter about their identity, to be less publicly gay or less publicly trans, or to closet themselves in order to receive services, also breaks trust, also not okay. Even saying like, could you be less about this because some other residents are uncomfortable? I also don't do that either, please, because why does one person's comfort, why does that person's comfort not matter and everybody else's comfort does? I posed that question as well. So these are things, language and behaviors to avoid. Let's talk about what to embrace. Always using people's correct name and pronouns, even if they're not official, even if they're not their legal name. My legal name's not Mary Beth. People call me that. Ain't no problem. Respecting boundaries about who folks want to be out to and when and where. Not everybody wants to be out to everybody else. And then when you make a mistake, as we said earlier, apologize, move on, do better next time. Don't spend too much time harping on it. It's important to say stuff like, I want you to feel understood here. So if there's something I'm not getting right, please speak up. A lot of queer people are conditioned to, if somebody says something invalidating or homophobic or transphobic, to just like swallow it and not say anything. And that creates stress on us, and it also does a disservice. We're like, advocates are being done a disservice when we're not saying like, hey, actually that was not cool. Can we talk about that? Saying ahead of time, I'm going to do my best to avoid harmful language, but it's not an excuse. Like, I'm still learning, and it's not but that's not an excuse. I will be grateful, not upset if you would correct me. So bringing the person in, not to say, reassure me that I'm not a bad person, but to say, hey, I'm on your team and I might need an assist sometimes. Saying to people that they get to choose who they're out to while they seek support through your program, because their identity is theirs to share. And then if you have LGBTQ people on staff who are out and comfortable engaging with other queer residents or program participants, maybe asking if it would be helpful to talk to a queer person about what they're going through. All of this is to say, we do all of this because centering how our words might impact people rather than how we intend them to impact people, validating victim survivors' experiences and respecting their boundaries as both an LGBTQ person and a survivor of violence builds trust and reinforces self-determination, which is what we're trying to do here, right? So as a community, we can all be involved in violence prevention and intervention in our own ways. There are lots of different actions on the screen that you can take today to contribute to a community free of DV. And I want to encourage you to think about some of the ways that you can dedicate yourself to show up for queer and trans victim survivors where you live and work. And while we do that, while you think about that, if you have other questions, I'm going to take a look at the Q&A. If you want to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A for these last 12-ish minutes, you can let me know. I have a question in the Q&A. I have heard both that it is important to share a pronoun in an email signature and that it's become insulting to share, especially in the email signature. Could you comment on which is preferred and which is most inclusive? I wish I could, but as I've said earlier, some queer and trans people really like that everybody puts their pronouns in their signatures. Some queer and trans people think I am so tired of hearing and seeing people's pronouns in their email signatures. We're all different. We like different things. We don't all like plug into the matrix and talk to each other to decide which thing is the most inclusive. Just like straight people don't. There's not like a straight hive mind, Congress, but there's not like a straight hive mind that decides we all believe this or not. There's not a gay hive mind either. So it's very individual. Yeah, as Joe's saying in the chat, I would say, like, don't make it a policy organization-wide that we are or we are not going to do pronouns and email signatures. Let people do it if that's what they want. Let people refrain if they don't want to. I think the argument to sit for the fact that email signature pronouns are not inclusive is that, well, if everybody has to, what if somebody's not out yet? And so there's the risk that somebody who is not out as non-binary or is not out at work as being a trans woman yet, like hasn't started their transition at work, might be forced to disclose before they're ready. So that's an argument for why those signatures are divisive. But I would just say, leave it up to the individuals who want to do that. Another question, which I'm loving, what language can a co-conspirator or ally use to correct someone in the moment who is using the wrong pronoun or language when talking to or about LGBTQ folks? This is a very good question, and The answer is hard because it requires us to do something which, as humans, we are not super conditioned to do, which is make people uncomfortable, or correct people out loud. Yeah, correct and move on is great. It does mean that you have to like get a little oomph in your step and say, and if somebody is misgendering a person, saying she, every time they say she, you say he, just interject he and continue. And if it becomes a pattern in that person's conversation, you can stop them and say, hey, you are, I don't know if you know this, but you've been using she to refer to this person, and actually they use he, him pronouns. And then moving on if it becomes a pattern. If it's a one-time thing, interject the correct one, keep interjecting the correct one. If it becomes a pattern of ignorance, name the pattern and say actually and correct. If it is an intentional malicious thing, say, no, that person uses he pronouns. You are intentionally misgendering them. And I would honestly, like, if you want to end the conversation and say, I'm done having this conversation about this person if you're not going to use the correct name and pronouns for them, I think that is also a very acceptable thing to do. All right. Those are all the questions that we have in the Q&A. If you have more, I would love to hear it. I would love to hear them and answer as best as I can. But there are some resources here available. On the left are specific to people in Minnesota. On the right are national and international resources. Lots more resources. Lots of further reading. I mentioned a couple of studies and books throughout this, so go ahead and take a look at those. Here's our specific contact info, ways to get in touch with us at Women's Advocates. You don't have to live in Minnesota or a specific county to reach out to us, and you don't have to be a woman to reach out to us. Thank you. Our services are open to everybody. Speaking of, we are recruiting for our October cohort of the online survivor support groups, which has a women's cohort and an open gender cohort. You can see the support group interest form here and fill it out. You can scan the QR code on that slide and fill it out. Tell your friends, tell your coworkers. Don't worry, certificate links are coming. In the meantime, here is also a link to our post-webinar survey. It only takes a couple minutes to fill out. I would super appreciate it if you could. And finally, here we go. Here's a link to download, to scan the QR code, to download a copy of the presentation. A copy of the presentation will also be emailed to you in a couple of days. Here, I'm going to put a certificate of attendance link in the chat. You can get to that now, or you can wait until we email you. You can also join our monthly listserv and check out our upcoming events at this link in the chat as well. So yeah, certificates of attendance are available at that link. Scan the QR code to download a copy of the presentation, or wait until we email you on Monday or Tuesday with all of that good stuff too. Thank you all so much for being here. Happy Pride. For my fellow LGBTQ community members, I'm so glad you're here. I want you to know that you're not alone, and that I hope we can start having these conversations more often in the community. To the straight folks who joined, thank you for coming and thank you for learning with us. I am just thrilled that you all showed up here today, and I hope that you've taken something away that can help you support the queer victim survivors that you're working with. Happy Pride. Thank you. Take good care, everybody.